Chapter 5. As Mac and Blaine rewired the mine, Billy had gone ahead at Schaefer's command. Under the cover of the bank of the stream, he had sneaked his way to within 10 feet of the sentry, standing guard in the trees beyond the camp. Only the man was on less than red alert, since he was smoking a ganja cigarette and listening to a Walkman through a set of earphones. He swayed slightly to the beat of the music. Like a dart, Billy shot up from the ground, pulling the sentry to him, covering his mouth as he yanked his head backward, dropping him to the ground. With his other hand, he plunged his combat knife right under the man's breastbone, killing him instantly. Billy could hear the faint sound of the music leaking out of the earphones. Billy Joel's Uptown Girl. "Beware of rock and roll, man," whispered Billy to the dead gorilla. "It'll turn your brains to mush." With an unguarded hole now in the southwest corner of the camp, Billy motioned to the others forward. Schaefer came up from the bank and passed Billy. When he reached the edge of the trees, he went down on his belly again and crawled close to the main entrance, where he took cover behind the rusted skeleton of an ancient truck. Its rear wheels had been hefted onto concrete blocks, the engine idling slowly. One wheel was attached to a belt drive hooked to a pump which was drawing water from the nearby stream. A second guard sat in the open cab of the truck, desultorily watching the high ground above the camp and looking a little woozy from the gas fumes spewing out of the truck's exhaust. Another guerrilla beside the truck was attending to some radio equipment liberated from the US chopper. He swore a continual stream because the circuits were too complicated for him. He was a shortwave man, and his guerrilla training hadn't yet caught up with the computer chip. The man behind the wheel of the truck slapped at a fly buzzing around his ear and was about to suggest to the radio man that they break out some Carta Blanca. They'd done enough for the revolution for one day. Just then, hearing a noise from the passenger's side of the truck, he turned to meet Mac's sledgehammer fist as it smashed into his throat, severing his windpipe before he could scream. Simultaneously, Blaine came from around the truck's front fender behind the radio man, pulling him down and puncturing his chest twice with his combat knife. The only sound that accompanied either death was a low exhale of breath and a gurgle of blood in the throat. Mac and Blaine prided themselves on the silence of their technique. Any sort of cry would have taken the skill out of it. You couldn't count a kill that was noisy. At exactly the same moment, Ramirez moved into position to the side and above the camp. He carefully checked the readiness of his grenade launcher. 6 shots, all loaded. Then he set his MP5 in front of him, waiting for a whistle from Schaefer. Schaefer, meanwhile, had moved to the cab of the truck as Mac and Blaine retreated back to the bushes, moving closer to the camp. Schaefer located a satchel charge looped over the gearshift. The truck's engine still rumbled and coughed, and the body of the gorilla was slumped against the dash in such a way that Schaefer couldn't follow the wiring to its source to destabilize it. If he turned the ignition off, someone in the camp would come running. As he peered out from the doorless side of the vehicle, he saw Ramirez signaling to him from the hillside, nearly invisible in the thick brush. Schaefer made a sign like a deaf mute, indicating that Ramirez should take his cue from the truck. Looking lower down, Schaefer checked to be sure that Dillon and Hawkins were ready. Dillon's binoculars were focused on the machine gun emplacement, so was Hawkins' rifle. Everybody was in order. Schaefer put 2 fingers to his lips and gave a short, piercing 2-note whistle. If the guerrillas had been alert, they might have wondered what a blue jay from northern Minnesota was doing in the jungle. But they weren't alert. They were surfeited from the day's triumph, and they were lying belly up and fast asleep, just begging to be attacked. "Ready, kid?" Dillon asked, turning to Hawkins. "Yes, sir," whispered the Irishman excitedly. In a combat situation, Hawkins liked a chain of command. He was willing to put aside his former surliness to the black man for the sake of having a superior officer. He did not see it as a contradiction. Before was a power struggle. This was war. Hawkins liked his wars to have rules. As they slipped through the high grass to the edge of the camp, Schaefer was slicing through the belt drive with his combat knife. The webbing of the belt was easily 1/2 an inch thick, and Dutch was sweating with concentration as he worked the knife. At last, it severed through the tough fibers, and the end snapped like a whip, and the engine chugged louder. Then Schaefer moved to the rear of the truck and bent down between the wheels like a powerlifter about to do a squat. The truck weighed 1.5 tons. Schaefer heaved up, his face beet red with concentration, veins almost bursting his temples as he focused all his strength on deadlifting the truck off its blocks. Pouring every ounce of muscle into the task, his mouth parted in a grimace and a low growl boiled in his throat. Schaefer could feel its rusted springs and frame begin to groan as it shifted off its perch. With a final grunt and thrust, he lifted the axle clear of the concrete blocks and heaved it forward. The breath exploded from his mouth in a cry of victory. The truck lurched forward with a shudder, then slowly lumbered down the hill, its tireless rims digging into the soft earth as Schaefer rolled into cover of thick vegetation by the river. As the truck gathered speed and sound, one of the guerrillas looked up the hill with sudden alarm, startled to see the rattling vehicle bearing down on the camp. Barking orders to several comrades, he gathered a small group of surprised men, who scurried up the slope to try to stop it. But it rolled faster and faster towards the clearing, uprooting plants and spitting stones as it barreled headlong. It was heading towards the main palapa. The guerrillas' outstretched arms, holding hands like students at a rally, made a fruitless attempt to slow the truck's progress. It flung them aside like toy soldiers and smashed through the front wall, collapsing the thatch roof and bursting through the other side. Shattered stalks of bamboo walls and war room furniture exploding in its path across the clearing. 6 bewildered guerrillas turned and looked back up the hill, searching for something to explain the freak disaster. As they stood there, stunned, Schaefer was a beat ahead of them. He pulled the pin of a pinecone grenade and footballed it into the air. It arced dead center for the camp, spiraling above the guerrillas' heads, then bounced on the ground twice before it rolled into the fuel dump. There was a moment's agonizing pause, during which even the jungle twitterers seemed to hold their breath. Then the grenade blew, igniting the fuel, and the dump exploded in an incredible fireball, roaring yellow and orange with thunderous crashes. Shrapnel whizzed in all directions, razoring a guerrilla's arm at the elbow, blinding another in one eye. The banana palm on the downhill slope suddenly seemed to shrivel. The alien withdrew to the safety of the ground as if it couldn't bear the intensity of what was starting to happen. Its optic cells were blinded by the white-hot flashes of the explosion, its heat-sensitive radar temporarily overwhelmed. Power like this made it frightened of men, and it hated to be frightened. It had its own code, if nothing so real as pride or honor. It simply could not tolerate any power more explosive than its own. So it sank into itself to figure out a strategy. It had to win, even here on this weakling planet whose creatures were bent on destroying one another. As a score of confused men scattered out of the various huts, a second explosion sounded. This one caused by the satchel in the truck as it detonated with an ear-splitting roar. The truck smithereened into fragments of steel which shot through the camp like a shrapnel bomb. 2 huts collapsed into puffs of straw, 3 men were torn up as they ran, and only 2 of them died right away. As soon as the explosion settled, Schaefer came darting down the slope in the truck's path, taking advantage of the dazed state of the rebels. Without aiming at anyone in particular, he tore off round after round with his M203, wounding and killing several guerrillas as they staggered about. As Hawkins and Dillon ran down, leaving Ramirez behind to cover them, some of the guerrillas had recovered their wits and jumped to man their weapons. Bullets burst at Hawkins and Dillon's feet as they closed in on Schaefer to form a wedge. Schaefer slammed another round of 40mm cartridges into his gun, and the 3 men sprayed fire. Blaine and Mac erupted out of the bushes behind the main hut, a withering curtain of lead on the right flank. So now the commandos were coming in like a pincer from both sides, and the guerrillas didn't know where to aim. Mac gutted a hulking fullback with his combat knife, then spun around and slit another man's throat with his backswing. They were basically ripping the camp to shreds. A guerrilla lieutenant, futilely trying to bark orders, let out a blood-curdling scream as his clothes and skin went up in flames from a direct grenade hit. He dived into the jungle and flailed about, blazing in phosphorus flames. Ramirez, poised on the slope with his grenade launcher, kept lobbing his missiles behind the camp so none of the enemy could slip through and escape across the stream. Suddenly, he sighted 2 guerrillas diving into position at the machine gun emplacement. Frantically, they worked to load the chamber, but just as they swung to aim at the left flank of the commando assault, Ramirez let loose with a double grenade. At the exact moment that the guerrilla got Schaefer, Dillon, and Hawkins in his sights, his head blew off. As the grenades detonated and took the machine gun ammo with them, the whole bunker blew 20 feet into the air, making hamburger out of the 2 guerrillas. In one of the few remaining huts, a terrified rebel took shaky aim at Schaefer as the major stopped to reload. Just in time, Dillon noticed him about to open fire, and he screamed a warning to Dutch, "Right shoulder!" Instantly, Schaefer hit the ground as a shroud of bullets passed inches above his head. But even as he flattened against the turf, he rolled and fired the 203, completely destroying the hut and the enemy gunners as well. High on the hill above the smoking battleground, a jackal peered out of a shallow cave, cautious and alert. Or at least it was a jackal a minute ago. Now, if you came up close and looked into its yellow eyes, you would have observed the faintest network of scales, as if the eye was composed of thousands of minute chambers, intricate as a beehive. For the alien had advanced again. Now for the first time it occupied the body of a hot-blooded mammal. From a single patch of jackal hair, snagged by a branch at the mouth of the cave, the alien had replicated with a massive surge of power, and now its matted fur twitched away the jungle flies as it watched the carnage below. It liked the feel of blood in its veins. It even felt a kind of kinship to the mad warrior running riot in the camp. Its eyes slowly adjusted to the explosive blasts that had earlier seemed to blind it. An eerie, surreal kaleidoscope unfolded in its heat vision as it scanned the camp. Screams of mutilation and pain echoed through the jungle as laser-like rockets zapped in all directions, reducing men and equipment to ruin. One of the last surviving guerrillas stood in the entrance to the main palapa, covering his comrades as they fell back inside. It was the captain who performed the execution. Billy, who'd been scrabbling across the roof of the hut immediately adjacent, jumped down and landed directly in front of the armed man, who swung his gun around towards the Indian. Just then, another guerrilla rushed around the corner of the hut, slashing out at Billy with his combat knife, razoring his cheek. Spinning like a scorpion, Billy whipped his arm around the gorilla's chest, locking his elbow in a cracking motion and using the man as a shield when the captain fired, thus spilling his own comrade's guts. Then Billy pointed the tip of his shotgun at the startled captain's face and blew him off his feet. He released his hold on the dead man, and the body collapsed just where the executed man had fallen earlier, but you could no longer tell whose blood was whose. Billy stepped over the dead rebels, threw back the curtain and raced down the stairs, firing indiscriminately. He had no fear for himself. He was determined to eliminate anyone left in the main stronghold, and he seemed to move in a kind of magic circle of protection. No one was going to stop him. Meanwhile, Blaine crept forward to the entrance, providing cover for Billy while the Indian cleaned out the hut. Blaine didn't notice the crouching gorilla circling behind him at the edge of the stream. The gorilla fired a grenade round, which exploded at Blaine's feet, fragments of shrapnel ripping into his vest. One jagged flash of metal lodged into his shoulder. But as the present danger didn't allow the luxury of responding to the excruciating pain, Blaine just narrowed his eyes and dutifully swiveled around, growling savagely as he opened fire in a back and forth motion, ripping through the enemy soldier till he was a bloody lump of dying flesh, bleeding into the water. Then Mac charged out of the jungle, as if some instinct had told him his body was wounded. Blaine flashed him a peace sign and grinned, completely shrugging off the blood that seeped down the arm of his khaki shirt. "Hey, what's a little blood?" he seemed to be saying. The jungle clearing was suddenly deathly quiet. Apparently, they were all either blown away or had fled into the trees. The commandos began to close in on the main palapa. They could hear the sporadic firing of Billy's rifle in the underground bunker as he nosed around, but there didn't seem to be any guerrillas left. They regrouped by the door, glancing quickly at one another to make sure they were all still in one piece. Ramirez had bloodied his lip hitting the dirt, but otherwise Blaine's was the only injury. "Looks like a fucking Purple Heart to me," cracked Mac as he eyed Blaine's shoulder. "Yo, Billy," called Schaefer into the palapa. "What have you got down there?" "Looks like the friggin' Pentagon, Major," Billy shouted back, but just as he finished speaking, there was a burst of machine gun fire in the bunker. Schaefer and Ramirez bolted in and ran down the crude stairs. The palapa was dug deeply into the soft earth, the walls reinforced with sandbags. A string of electric bulbs zigzagged across the trench at about shoulder height, powered by a small generator that wheezed and sighed in one corner. The underground space was maybe 30 by 50 feet, partitioned off by stacks of wooden crates full of supplies. It looked like the cellar of a hardware store. Schaefer and Ramirez darted between the aisles, sweeping every shadowy corner with their rifles cocked. About 20 feet along the center aisle was a door in the wall of earth. Savagely, Schaefer kicked it open. He suddenly faced a wide-eyed gorilla, whom he flattened with a single bullet to the brain, since he wasn't in the mood to talk. He and Ramirez hopped over the dead man and surveyed a long corridor that tunneled deep into the earth towards the stream. At the far end was another stairway, which obviously led to an escape route. The two commandos barreled down the corridor just in time to see a wide-eyed rebel struggling to open the hatch. Ramirez tore off a full burst of bullets that exploded into the fleeing man. The force spun him around, and he took a last opportunity to fire, sending a scattering of bullets into the earthen roof, which rained down dirt on the commando's head. Then the rebel fell dead at the foot of the steps. Schaefer and Ramirez turned and headed back to the main chamber. As they came around into the central aisle, a wounded man was crawling behind a stack of crates, dragging a bloody leg. Schaefer and Ramirez ducked as he threw down on them with a machine pistol. Schaefer heaved at the pile of crates and tipped it over, crashing several 100 pounds of ordnance on top of the man. The machine bullets veered off target. Then Schaefer rushed on the guy and bashed his head with the butt of his rifle, knocking him senseless. Jamming in a new magazine, the Major scanned the palapa for other movements, then nodded to Ramirez to proceed along the aisle. Cat-like, Ramirez covered the last 20 feet and came onto a couple of bodies heaped at the foot of a last set of stairs that disappeared up into the jungle. There was no telling how many had escaped this way, though Billy had clearly nailed the last two who hadn't. "Billy must have gone up after them," Ramirez called, back to the Major. "I'll go cover his ass." As he raced up the steps and disappeared into the trees, Dutch wasn't worried about either of them. He'd rather have his men out there hounding the enemy to earth than wait and let the guerrillas creep back for a second round. Up above in the clearing, Schaefer could hear Hawkins barking into the radio as Mac and Blaine set up the portable satellite dish antenna. Otherwise, there was stillness.